Okay, so forget almost everything you've been told about cholesterol. Seriously. Because the story you've heard, the one about fat clogging your arteries, bad cholesterol being the villain, butter being basically poison, most of that story is either oversimplified, outdated, or just flat out wrong. And I know that sounds like a big claim. I know some of you are thinking, wait, my doctor put me on a statin. Are you saying that was a mistake? That's not exactly what I'm saying, but it's complicated, and by the end of this video, you're going to understand your own cholesterol results in a way that most people, including a lot of physicians, don't. By the end of this, you'll know what to actually ask your doctor, what your results really mean, and why the figure everyone's been obsessing over for 40 years is the wrong thing to be measuring. Let's get into it. So here's where this whole thing started. Back in the 1950s, a researcher named Ancel Keys put forward what became known as the diet-heart hypothesis. The idea was simple. You eat fat, your cholesterol goes up, your arteries clog, you have a heart attack. Clean, logical, easy to explain. The problem? The data he used to support it was cherry-picked. Keys looked at 22 countries. He published findings from 7. The countries that didn't fit his theory, the ones where people ate a lot of fat but had low heart disease rates, he left them out. And this wasn't some fringe accusation made decades later. Other researchers called it out at the time. But Keys was persuasive, well-connected, and the idea caught on anyway. By the 1960s, it had become policy. By the 1980s, it was gospel. Low-fat diets, margarine instead of butter. Dietary guidelines built around the idea that fat, especially saturated fat, was the enemy, and total cholesterol became the figure everyone obsessed over. Now let me tell you what's going on inside your body. Cholesterol isn't a poison. It's not a waste product. Your body makes it on purpose. Your liver produces about 75% of the cholesterol in your bloodstream because you need it. It builds cell membranes. It produces hormones. It helps make vitamin D. Your brain is literally 25% cholesterol by weight. This is not a villain molecule. So check this out. When researchers went back and reanalyzed the original data from that era, including data from the Minnesota coronary experiment that was buried for decades, they found something that contradicted the whole framework. Lowering saturated fat and replacing it with vegetable oils did lower total cholesterol, but it didn't reduce heart disease deaths. In some groups, it increased them. Let that sink in. The foundational study that shaped 40 years of dietary advice had data sitting in a researcher's basement that told a completely different story. It wasn't published until 2016. And this is what worries me. We're not talking about a minor footnote. We're talking about generations of people, your parents, maybe you, who were told to avoid eggs, avoid butter, eat low-fat everything, and take a pill to bring their cholesterol down. And the thing they were chasing? Total cholesterol? It turns out that's one of the weakest predictors of heart disease we have. I've talked to people in their 50s and 60s who have been on statins for a decade based on a total cholesterol reading above 200. They've never had a heart attack, no calcium scoring, no advanced lipid panel, just, your result is too high, here's your prescription. And they've never once been told to question whether that's even the right thing to be measuring. That's what this video is about. So with that context in mind, let's talk about what the result on your lab report is telling you, and more importantly, what it's not. When your doctor says your cholesterol is high, they're usually talking about total cholesterol. That's a combined figure. It rolls up your bad cholesterol, your good cholesterol, and a portion of your triglycerides into one result. And if that comes back above 200, a lot of physicians flag it. Above 240, they really flag it. The problem with that? Total cholesterol as a single figure is like getting a weather report that just says outside. Is it raining? Sunny? A tornado? You have no idea. It tells you something is there. It tells you almost nothing about what's going on, because what matters is this. Not all bad cholesterol is the same. This is the part most people have never been told. LDL, what everyone calls bad cholesterol, comes in different sizes. You've got large, fluffy particles, and you've got small, dense particles, and these two things behave completely differently in your body. The large, fluffy kind? Pretty benign. It floats around, does its job, moves on. The small, dense kind? That's the stuff that burrows into arterial walls. That's what triggers inflammation. That's the type that correlates with heart disease risk. And your standard cholesterol panel, the one your doctor orders at your annual physical, doesn't distinguish between them. At all. You could have a sky-high reading made up almost entirely of the large, fluffy kind, and be told you're at high risk. You could have a moderate reading dominated by the small, dense variety and be told you're fine. Neither conclusion would be accurate. There was a major analysis, built on data from the Jupiter trial and subsequent research, that showed particle count was a significantly stronger predictor of cardiovascular events than cholesterol concentration alone. In plain terms, how many of these particles you have floating around matters more than how much cholesterol is inside them, and most people have never had that measured. I see this all the time. Someone comes in, they've been watching their diet, they're exercising, their total cholesterol looks okay, maybe even good, and they feel like they're on top of it. And then we run an advanced lipid panel, and their particle count tells a completely different story. Or the opposite. Someone terrified because their reading looks high on a basic panel, and it turns out their particles are almost entirely the large benign type, and their actual risk profile is fine. The standard panel is a blunt instrument being used for a precise job, and for 40 years, that's what most people have been managed on. So what should you ask for? An NMR lipoprofile or an advanced lipid panel that includes particle count and size. ApoB is another marker worth knowing. It measures the total number of harmful particles in your blood and is increasingly considered one of the best single indicators of cardiovascular risk we have. These tests exist. They're not experimental. A lot of insurance covers them, but you usually have to ask. So now that you understand why the standard panel is incomplete, let's talk about what's driving cardiovascular disease. Because this is where the conversation really shifts. Inflammation. That's the word that keeps coming up in the research. Not cholesterol, not fat. Inflammation. Think about what's happening inside your arteries when things go wrong. LDL particles, particularly those small dense ones we just talked about, they get into the arterial wall, and when they do, your immune system responds. White blood cells rush in, inflammation follows, plaque starts to form. That plaque hardens over time, and eventually you end up with a narrowed, stiffened artery that's vulnerable to rupture. Cholesterol is present in that process, but it's not the cause. Think about it this way. If you walked into a room and saw firefighters, you wouldn't assume the firefighters started the fire. That's a lot like what's happening here. Its presence is a signal, not the source. And this is where a marker called CRP, C-reactive protein, becomes really important. CRP is a measure of systemic inflammation in your body. And the research on this is striking. A landmark study called the Jupiter trial, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, took people who had normal cholesterol levels but elevated CRP, people who would have been told by most standard assessments that they were fine. And it found their cardiovascular risk was significantly elevated anyway, just from the inflammation marker alone. Think about what that means. You could have a normal cholesterol result and still be quietly building toward a heart attack because the inflammation driving the damage is completely invisible on a standard lipid panel. Now sit with this for a moment, because this is the part that I think matters most. Heart disease is still the #1 killer in this country. It takes more lives every year than cancer, more than accidents, more than anything else. And we've had 40 years, 4 decades, of dietary guidelines, public health campaigns, and prescription medications all built around lowering a single figure. And yet heart disease is still the #1 killer in this country. More lives every year than cancer, more than accidents, more than anything else. And I'm not saying statins don't help anyone. For people with existing cardiovascular disease or very high genetic risk, the evidence for statins is real, but the number of people being put on them purely based on a total cholesterol figure, without any inflammation markers, without particle sizing, without a coronary calcium score, that is enormous. And a lot of those people are being treated for a risk profile that's never been properly measured. I had someone tell me once they'd been on a statin for 8 years. 8 years. And they asked their doctor once whether they actually needed it and were told, "Your cholesterol is high. This is what we do." No further conversation. And this person had spent 8 years worried, taking a daily medication with real side effects, muscle pain, fatigue, in some cases cognitive effects, and they'd never once been given the full picture. That's not a failure of medicine. It's a failure of the model. A model built on a flawed study from the 1950s that became policy before the evidence was anywhere near strong enough to support it. You deserve better than that. And understanding this, just what we've covered so far, puts you in a position to have a completely different conversation with your doctor. So with all of that said, let's make this practical. Because understanding why the old model is broken is one thing. Knowing what to do differently is another. First thing, get a better test. If you haven't had an advanced lipid panel, ask for one. Ask specifically for particle count, particle size, and ApoB. If your doctor isn't familiar with these or pushes back, that's a conversation worth having. You can also ask for a high-sensitivity CRP test, that's your inflammation marker, and if you're over 45 and haven't had one, a coronary artery calcium score is one of the most useful tools available for quantifying plaque buildup. It's a low-dose CT scan, takes about 10 minutes, and it will tell you more about your real heart disease risk than a decade of standard cholesterol readings. Second thing, take a hard look at what's driving inflammation in your life, because that's the real lever here, and the biggest drivers aren't the ones you'd expect. Refined carbohydrates and sugar. This is where it gets interesting, because for 40 years we were told to replace fat with carbohydrates. Low-fat crackers, low-fat yogurt loaded with sugar, cereals marketed as heart healthy. And what does excess sugar do in your body? It raises triglycerides. It promotes the formation of those small, dense particles, the dangerous kind. It drives insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is one of the strongest independent predictors of cardiovascular disease we know of. The low-fat era didn't save us from heart disease. There's a real argument to be made that it made things worse. Sleep is another one people underestimate. Consistently poor sleep, under 6 hours, raises CRP. It raises cortisol. It promotes systemic inflammation throughout the body. Research published in the journal Sleep found that short sleep duration was independently associated with higher cardiovascular risk, even after controlling for other factors. You can eat well and exercise regularly and still be quietly inflaming your cardiovascular system if you're chronically sleep deprived. And then there's the thing nobody wants to talk about: chronic stress. Sustained psychological stress elevates cortisol, which promotes inflammation, which drives the exact arterial damage process we've been discussing. It's measurable. It shows up in your blood. None of this means cholesterol is irrelevant. It's not. If your ApoB is genuinely elevated, if your particle count is high, those are real things worth addressing. This isn't about throwing out every tool, it's about using better ones. But think about this. Not just today, but over the next few weeks. When was the last time you looked at your lab results and understood what you were looking at? When was the last time you asked your doctor to explain not just what your results are, but what they mean? And whether the right things are even being measured? Because you're not a passive participant in your own health. You never were. And the people who do best, the ones who make it into their 70s and 80s with their cardiovascular system intact, they're not the ones who just took the prescription and stopped asking questions. They're the ones who got curious, who pushed for more information, who understood that a single result on a lab report is the beginning of a conversation, not the end of one. And that's what I want for you. If this opened up some new questions for you, that's a good thing. Sit with them. Bring them to your next appointment. And if you want to go deeper on any of this, the inflammation side, the dietary piece, what a real heart-healthy morning routine looks like, I'll be covering all of that in upcoming videos. Take care of yourself. You've got more tools than you think.